Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. My dear students, Assalamu alaikum. How are you feeling? I hope you're feeling well and that you are enjoying these introductory lectures in economics. And I hope that at least some of you are looking at the questions that I've put up on the web for you. Actually, let me ask you, how many of you attempted the questions that I put up for the last lecture? Very impressive. Most of you. And how many enjoyed it? That's very impressive as well. Good, as expected. And how many got them all right? Doesn't matter. I mean, the important thing is that you tried. It is very important in economics to go back to questions and test yourself on how well you've grasped certain concepts. And these sample questions have been put up exactly for that reason. So constantly appeal to your common sense, and your common sense will lead you to the right answer. That's my word for you in economics. Okay, so before we launch into our discussion on supply, which is the topic of today's lecture, let's do a little recap on what we covered in our previous lecture. Now, what did we cover in our previous lecture? Now, if you recall, we covered a lot of ground. We talked about the free market economy. We talked about the price mechanism. We talked about the interdependence of factor and goods markets. But crucially, we talked about demand. We developed our basic foundations about the concept of demand. We started with the law of demand. We said that as the price of a commodity increased, the quantity demanded of that commodity decreased. Vice versa, if the price of the commodity decreased, then the quantity demanded increased. But we said that this law of demand was not enough to satisfy economists. And as always, economists wanted to dig deeper. And the way they formalized this law of demand was through two effects: the income effect and the substitution effect, correct? Now, what was the income effect? We noted that the income effect was the effect of an increase in the price of a good on the purchasing power of a consumer, or the real income of a consumer. And we noted that as the price of a normal good went up, a consumer's purchasing power went down, and therefore his consumption of that good reduced, declined. However, we noted that for an inferior good, it was possible for the income effect to be positive. So it was possible that if the price of margarine, let's say, went up, and consumers felt poorer than before, then they might actually respond to that by increasing, not decreasing, but increasing their consumption of margarine. Then we talked about the substitution effect, and we noted that this was mainly in relation to what happened when the price of a substitute good fell or increased relatively to the price of this good. And we saw that, let's say, if the price of this good increased, then consumers would want to consume the substitute good, which is still available at a lower price. And so the quantity demanded of this good would fall when the price of this good increased. So there were two effects at play. There was the income effect and there was the substitution effect. And combining these two effects, we got the price effect, which gave us the law of demand. That is, for any normal good, as the price of that good increased, the quantity demanded decreased unambiguously. Now, armed with this concept of income effect and substitution effect, we launched into a discussion of how we could set up demand schedules and how we could draw demand curves. And we saw that we could draw demand curves in PQ space, so that we could have price on the vertical axis and quantity demanded on the horizontal axis. Or we could draw it in IQ space, where I denotes income. So we could have income on the vertical axis and quantity demanded on the horizontal axis. And we noted that in the PQ space, the demand curve was downward sloping, whereas in the IQ space, the demand curve was, yes, upward sloping. Then we saw how we could aggregate individual demand curves into market demand curves. And we saw that this was simply an aggregation, a horizontal aggregation of individual demand curves across all the individuals in the market. Now, once we had developed the concept of the market demand curve, we started talking about the factors which could cause shifts in the market demand curve. And we identified a number of factors. We talked about tastes, we talked about the income of consumers, we talked about the prices of substitute goods, the prices of complementary goods, and you know what those terms mean, right? Substitutes and complementary goods, they are very important. So we talked about all of these factors which could cause shifts in the demand curve. Finally, we talked about how demand functions could be written in algebraic form as opposed to the graphical form which we had earlier stressed. And we gave examples of a couple of demand equations. We expressed the quantity demanded in terms of price, and we expressed the quantity demanded in terms of income. And we saw that in the first case, again, the demand curve was downward sloping, and in the second case, the demand curve was upward sloping. Now, the reason I have recapped on all these points is because all of these principles will today be applied to the concept of supply. But so supply is actually the topic of our today's lecture. But before we do that, we need to understand what supply means and what is the relationship between supply and prices. So in order to demonstrate this relationship to you a little bit better and in layman's terms, let's give you an example of a farmer. So let's imagine that you are a farmer, or I am a farmer, or any one of us, and that you own a piece of land. But the piece of land that you own is not in, let's say, Lahore or Sahiwal. It's not a plain land. It's a land which is a mix of some hilly area and some valley area in the middle. So it's like hills surrounded by some plain valley, very fertile in the middle. Now, as a farmer, you have to make the decision as to whether you want to devote this land to the grazing of cattle, for example, cows, sheep, goats, or whether you want to allocate this land for the growing of crops, cash crops, wheat, or vegetables. So how do you make that decision? Now, in order to make that decision, you need to understand what the prices are of these commodities or these animals in the market. Because the price of these animals or these commodities is the return that you will get on your effort that you'll put in to produce or prepare these animals for sale. So you take a trip to the market. You go to the market and you see that it is Eid time. It's Bakar Eid time. And everybody is in the market to buy goats and sheep and cattle. And so you think that the prices are really high, so why shouldn't I devote all my land, including the fertile plain, to the grazing of cattle? And so that would be a sensible decision on your part. However, on some other day you go to the market and find that the demand for cattle is okay and the demand for vegetables is quite good. So you might come back and devote the fertile plain area, the valley area in the middle, to the growing of vegetables. Then you need to decide which vegetables to grow. So you go to the market again. And let's imagine that there are only two vegetables. There is potato and there is onions. So you see that the price of potato and the price of onions is similar to start with. So you might come back and decide to allocate your land half-half between potatoes and onions, assuming, of course, that the production cost of both potatoes and onions is the same. On another day, you go to the market and now find that the price of potatoes has gone up. So you will come back and say, well, the price has gone up. Let me devote more of my land to the production of potatoes. And so you will do that. Note that the production of potatoes has gone up at the expense of the production of onions. And this is where the concept of opportunity cost comes in. Each extra potato that you produce incurs an opportunity cost in terms of the onion production foregone, when you are on the production possibilities frontier, if you remember from the second lecture. So, if the prices of potatoes continue to rise, you might decide to even devote the entire valley area to the production of potatoes. In fact, there might come a time that you might think that I can even start growing potatoes on the hills, even though it is very unproductive to grow potatoes there, because the land is not fertile and you have to put in a lot of fertilizers, so your production costs will be significantly higher when you grow potatoes on the hilly areas. And of course, your opportunity cost will be high as well, because the opportunity cost of growing potatoes on the hilly areas will be the grazing of cattle, which are naturally suitable for grazing on hilly areas. But you will still go ahead by planting potatoes on the hilly areas if you feel that the price is sufficiently high to compensate you for the costs that you are incurring. So there are basically the major thing that comes out of this at 2 points. One, that as production costs go up, you need a higher price to compensate you for those production costs. And secondly, that as the profitability, the price of growing something increases, then you will have a natural desire to produce more of that good or commodity or crop or whatever to take advantage of the higher prices and make some more money. This, my dear friends, is the law of supply. And we have said it in so many words earlier on as well in the first, second and third lectures, that as the price of something increases, its quantity supplied also increases. But as in the case of demand, economists were not happy with this law of supply, and they wanted to dig deeper. So they tried to formalize the law of supply in terms of some sub-points. Let's see what they got at. Let's refer to our first slide. So now, as you can see, we have the familiar law of supply, which says that when the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied will also rise. Now, this has been broken down into 3 distinct parts, and we have alluded to this already in our example. The first one is that costs rise as output increases. Now, as we saw, that as firms supply more, they are likely to find that beyond a certain level of output, costs rise more and more rapidly. And this is consistent with the concept of increasing opportunity cost we developed in lecture 2. Now, in the case of the farm we have just considered, once potatoes have to be grown on the hillside, the costs of producing them will increase very sharply. Also, if the land has to be used more intensively, say by the use of more and more fertilizers, again, the costs of producing extra potatoes are likely to rise quite rapidly. It is the same for manufacturers as well. Beyond a certain level of output, costs are likely to rise rapidly as workers either have to be paid overtime or as machines approach capacity working. If higher output involves higher costs of production, producers will need to get a higher price if they are to be persuaded to produce the extra output. The second point, as you can see, is that higher price means more profit, and therefore firms will switch production from other goods to this good whose price has gone up. the higher the price of the good, the more profitable it becomes to produce, generally, assuming costs are constant. Firms will thus be encouraged to produce more of it by switching from producing other less profitable goods, and this is a standard principle. The third point says that new producers will emerge, and this is more of a long-term factor, that new producers will emerge and total supply will increase over the long term. So the principle here is that given time, if the price of a good remains high, new producers will be encouraged to set up the production. Total market supply thus rises. In our case, for example, by looking at this farmer's success, other farmers might be encouraged to buy pieces of land and grow potatoes or graze cattle as well. And so the total market supply would increase in that particular case. Now, with that understanding of the law of supply, we can now develop an understanding of how supply schedules are set up and how supply curves can be drawn. Remember that this is exactly the chronology in which we approached demand. We understood the law of demand, and then we saw how demand schedules were set up and how demand curves were drawn. So let's go to how supply schedules can be studied. Let's go to our slide. Now, a supply schedule simply specifies the units of a good or service that a producer is willing to supply, that is QS, at alternative prices P over any given period of time. So it can be written as QS is equal to F, where F is a function of P. The graphic presentation of a supply schedule is a supply curve. The supply curve normally has a positive upward slope, indicating that the producer must receive a higher price for increased output because of the principle of increasing costs. A market supply curve is derived from each producer's supply curve by summing the units each producer is willing to supply at alternative prices. Now let's illustrate this through the use of our example with corn. The table here relates the number of bushels of corn supplied by an individual producer at alternative prices and the number of bushels of corn supplied by all corn producers in a market area. From columns 1 and 2, we find that the producer supplies 75 bushels of corn each month at $5 a bushel. At $1 a bushel, the producer supplies 10 bushels per month. This producer's supply schedule is plotted in the figure shown, and the curve is labeled small s. Now let's assume that there are 100 producers in the market area and that each producer is willing to supply the same quantities. Then the market supply schedule for these 100 producers is presented in column 3. When the price of corn is $5 a bushel, 7,500 bushels are supplied. Smaller amounts are supplied at lower prices. The market supply schedule is plotted in the figure shown, and the curve is labeled capital S. Now the market supply for a good or service is influenced not only by the commodity's price, but also by the number and size of producers, factor prices, technological changes, and or the government subsidies and taxes. We'll study these in greater detail shortly. This is similar to the case of demand, where we saw that the demand for any quantity depended not just on the price, but on a number of other factors like incomes, tastes, etc. Now in presenting the supply for a good or service as a schedule relating price and quantity supplied, these other variables other than the commodity's price are assumed to be constant. Thus the market demand for corn presented in our table and figure, we see that the quantity of corn supplied is related to the price per bushel, holding constant all other factors. So this is ceteris paribus. QS is equal to F P corn ceteris paribus where this indicates that variables other than the price of corn are being controlled for or are unchanged. When one or more of these variables change, there is a change in supply and therefore a shift in the supply curve. Let us now develop a better understanding of these other factors which cause shifts in the supply curve. Now, as shown in the slide, we can identify at least 6 other determinants of supply. So we have A, costs of production, B, profitability of alternative products or substitutes in supply, C, profitability of goods in joint supply, and I'll explain what this means, D, nature or other random shocks which can be both positive or negative, E, the aims of producers, and F, expectations of producers about the future. Now, if any of these change, then the supply curve will shift. Again, this is because the diagram only shows 2 variables, price and quantity. Therefore, if any of the other variables change, then the supply curve must be drawn again. In practice, this means the redrawing of the curve, and this is what we call a shift in the supply curve. Note that the method of showing changes in any of the determinants of supply other than price is identical to the method of showing changes in determinants of demand other than price. Now let's look at these 6 determinants of supply in a little bit more detail. Firstly, costs of production. If costs change, then the amount supplied is likely to change as well. So if the cost of an input increases, say the cost of wood to a furniture factory increases, then the amount supplied at all price levels will decrease. Let's see what the main reasons could be for a change in production costs. We can identify at least 4. 1. Change in input prices. Costs of production will rise if wages, raw material prices, rents, interest rates, or any other input prices rise. Note here that inputs here mainly mean the factors of production that we introduced in lecture 1, which was land, natural resources, capital, and labor. So wages relates to the return or the cost of labor. Then raw material prices is the cost of natural resources, rents are the cost of land, and interest rates are the cost of capital. The second reason for a change in costs could be change in technology. Technological advances can fundamentally alter the costs of production. Consider, for example, how the microchip revolution has changed production methods and information handling in virtually every industry in the world. A third reason why costs could change could be organizational changes. Various cost savings can be made in many firms by reorganizing production. In some cases, many firms can merge into one larger firm and realize important cost savings. So this could be an important reason as well. Finally, we have government policy which affects costs. Costs will be lowered by government subsidies and raised by various taxes. Subsidies are merely incentive payments given to firms, encouraging them to produce a certain good, whereas taxes are meant to penalize firms for producing certain goods. We will come to these shortly. The second determinant that we talked about was the profitability of alternative products, such as substitutes in supply. Now note that the profitability of any good can go up either because its price goes up or because its cost goes down. So in our case of the farm, let's say the onion profitability increases because of either the price of onion going up or because the yield on onion production going up, which reduces the cost of onion production. Both of these factors will reduce the supply for potatoes. a producer of two goods is likely to concentrate on the production of the more profitable good. This was very simple. C. Profitability of goods in joint supply. This may be considered a variant on the previous case. An example would be an oil refinery which finds that demand for one of its products, petrol, is increasing. To meet the increased demand for petrol, the refinery also produces diesel as a byproduct. The refinery will therefore increase the supply of diesel as well. So when goods are produced in joint supply and the demand for any one good increases, then the response of firms, which means that their increase in the supply of that good, will necessarily mean that the supply of the other good, which is jointly produced or produced as a byproduct, will also increase. Point D. Nature and other random shocks. This is something of a catch-all category. It includes problems caused by weather, natural catastrophes such as earthquakes and food and flood, effects of war on raw materials, etc., disputes, strikes, fire. For example, in our case, we have viruses affecting crop production. You must have heard of Gulabi Sundi and American Sundi. These can all be referred to as shocks, natural shocks beyond the control of producers. Then we have aims of producer. A firm may wish to maximize short-run profit, and we usually assume this in most cases in this introductory course. Or it may have one of many other aims, such as sales revenue maximization, growth, market share, or even survival. The quantity supplied will obviously be affected by the aims of the producer. So let's say a firm produces both cars and motorcycles. And motorcycles are the more profitable product to produce. But if the firm wants to establish leading market role or leading market leadership in cars, then it might produce cars in a very large quantity in order to procure that higher market share. So it depends very much on what the aims of the producer are and what the horizon of those aims is. Is it long term or short term? Finally, we have expectations of producers. If a producer expects prices to increase in the future, this could be because he or she expects that demand is going to go up in the future, then he/she may reduce the amount supplied because he would like to build up stocks to take advantage of the increased prices in the future. So once prices have risen, the producer can offload his stocks and sell them at the higher prevailing price. Note, however, that expectations may not always turn out to be true. The firm above risks having to clear stocks, perhaps even at a discount, if prices do not actually increase as expected. Since some of these factors are a little bit complex, let us illustrate some of these determinants in the context of the supply for butter. Now, put this question before you. What would cause the supply of butter to rise? A. A reduction in the costs of producing butter. This could be caused, say, by a reduction in the price of nitrogen fertilizer. This would encourage farmers to use more fertilizer, which would increase grass yields, which in turn would increase milk yields per acre. Alternatively, new technology may allow more efficient churning of butter. Or again, the government may decide to give subsidies to farmers to produce more butter. Then the supply of butter could rise because of B. A reduction in the profitability of producing cream or cheese, which are substitute products. So if these products became less profitable due, say, to a reduction in their price, due in turn to a reduction in consumer demand, more butter is likely to be produced instead. C. An increase in the profitability of skimmed milk. If consumers buy more skimmed milk, then an increased supply of skimmed milk is likely to lead to an increase in the supply of butter and other cream products, since they are jointly produced with skimmed milk. D. If weather conditions are favorable, grass yields and hence milk yields are likely to be high. This will increase the supply of butter and other milk products as well. Finally, if butter producers expect the price to rise in the near future, they may well decide to release less onto the market now and put more into frozen storage until the price does rise. Given this background, we can now look at how some of these factors will shift the supply curve to the right or to the left. Note that whenever there is an increase in the supply, this will be represented by a rightward or downward shift in the supply curve. So, for example, if costs fall due to decreases in factor or material prices or technological improvements or government subsidies, this will be reflected by a shift in the curve from S1 to S2. Similarly, if substitute profitability increases, this will reduce the supply of this product and we will move from S1 to S3, which is a leftward upward movement or upward shift of the supply curve. Then we could have random shocks, positive or negative. A positive shock would move the supply curve to the right, whereas a negative shock would move it to the left. Finally, you have expectations. If expectations are that future prices will rise, then naturally the supply curve will move from S1 to S3. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit of ground there. We've covered how an individual supply curve is drawn, how a market supply curve is drawn. But all this has happened in the context of graphs. But remember from the previous lecture that demand could also be represented in algebraic form. And the same holds true for supply as well. So let's talk a little bit about supply equations and see how they can capture what factors affect demand in what way. Let's go to our slide. A general supply function can be written in the form as shown. Qs is a function of Pg, Cg, A1 to An, J1 to Jm, R, A, Pge T plus 1. In other words, quantity supplied Qs depends on the price of the good Pg, the costs of production Cg, the profitability of alternative goods A1 to An, the profitability of goods jointly supplied J1 to Jm, nature and other random shocks R, the aims of producers A, and the expected price of the good Pge at some future time t plus 1. This is very similar to the demand equation we developed in the previous lecture. Using survey data and regression analysis, which we said was beyond the scope of this course, equations such as 6 can be estimated relating supply to some of these determinants. Note that not all determinants can be easily quantified, example nature and the aims of firms, and thus may have to be left out of the equation. The simplest form of supply equation relates supply to just one determinant. Thus, a function relating supply to price would be of the form Qs is equal to C plus dP. Note that this will be drawn in QP space, not PQ space. So we have quantity supplied on the vertical axis and price on the horizontal axis. Using regression analysis, values can be estimated for C and D. Thus, an actual supply equation might be something like Qs is equal to minus 500 plus 1000 P. Now, you might ask why I have put minus 500 and not plus 500. Now, the answer to that consists in the following. If it were plus 500, then at quantity supplied equals to 0, price would be negative. So this would be not tenable. By putting the intercept of this graph as negative, we ensure that when the quantity supplied just becomes positive, so Qs changes from 0 to 1, the price is positive. So in this case, when QS is equal to 0, the price obtained would be 1 over 2, which is 500 over 1000. This means that producers would start producing at a positive price. This makes sense as well. You would not expect producers to start producing goods at a negative price. Costs are incurred in the production of any good, and therefore price which compensates producers for those costs have to be positive at the minimum. Now look at this supply function. QS is equal to minus 500 plus 1000 P. If P changed, we would move along the supply curve S0. But if any determinant other than P changed, a new equation would result, and this would be represented by a shift in the supply curve. So let's say if C changed from minus 500 to minus 800. So this means that the curve would shift down by 300 units from S0 to S1. Now if C went up from minus 500 to minus 200, the curve would also shift up by 300 units to S2. However, we are talking in QP space, and you are more familiar with PQ space. So let's see how this particular supply function can be drawn in PQ space. All that is involved is flipping the equation in terms of P and expressing QS in terms of P. So the first equation, which is QS is equal to minus 500 plus 1000 P, becomes P is equal to half plus QS over 1000. We represent it with S0 prime. The second equation would be P is equal to 4 over 5 plus QS over 1000, and we represented with S1 prime. And the third equation, in which C was minus 200, we would have P is equal to 1 over 5 plus QS over 1000. As you can see, S1 prime and S2 prime are now on the opposite sides of S0 prime as they were in the QP graph. There, S1 was to the right of S0 and S2 was to the left of S0. Here, S2 prime is to the right of S0 prime and S1 prime is to the left of S0 prime. Two final points or observations about this analysis. What would happen if there was a change in D and not C? A change in D would mean that 1 over D would also change. And note that 1 over D is simply the slope of the supply curve in PQ space. So a higher D means a flatter supply curve in PQ space. A lower D means a steeper supply curve in PQ space. The second point is that more complex supply equations would relate supply to more than one determinant. For example, we could have something like QS is equal to 200 plus 80P minus 20A1 minus 15A2 plus 30J, where P is the price of the good, A1 and A2 are the profitabilities of two alternative goods that could be supplied instead, and J is the profitability of a good in joint supply. Note that it is no longer possible to show or represent this particular supply function in a two-dimensional graph, in a two-dimensional space such as QP or PQ. So that, my friends, concludes our discussion on supply. Now, armed with our understanding of supply and demand, we are now in a position to tackle the question of equilibrium in the market. Now, before we define the term equilibrium in the market, we need to understand what we mean by it. Remember earlier we talked about the demand schedule, and we said that at this price the consumer demands this much, and at this price the consumer demands this much, and so on and so forth. But note that that was mainly a theoretical exercise. For example, if you go to buy petrol at different petrol stations, you don't find different petrol stations offering different prices for petrol. You find that they virtually sell at the same price. So what do you mean when you say that at this price demand would be this much and at this price demand would be this much? What you basically mean there is that when the equilibrium price changes from one to another, what happens to the equilibrium quantity demanded? So that's where the concept of equilibrium comes in. Now let's get to the definition of equilibrium. Equilibrium, I personally would define as a state in which there are no shortages or surpluses. Now remember what the definitions of shortages and surpluses was. The definition of a shortage was when the demand for a commodity or a good exceeded its supply, whereas the definition of a surplus was when the demand of a commodity falls short of its supply. Now, in an equilibrium, demand is actually exactly equal to supply. So there are no shortages, no surpluses. The equilibrium price is the price which obtains at that point where demand equals supply. Now the point about equilibrium being a state where there are no shortages or surpluses connects very nicely with some of the earlier examples we studied. We saw that when there was a surplus, when supply was greater than demand, this would bid the price down until demand picks up to the level where it is equal to supply, and therefore equilibrium is restored. So this is how equilibrium comes into play, with supply on one hand and demand on the other. Let's now develop the concept of equilibrium through some graphical illustrations. Let's go to our slide. As we said earlier, equilibrium occurs where demand is equal to supply. Graphically, this is equivalent to saying that equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the market supply and market demand curves. In our graph, this point is point E, where supply curve S intersects the demand curve D. The equilibrium price P and the equilibrium quantity Q will now only change if either the supply curve shifts or the demand curve shifts. Note that trade takes place only when consumers and producers agree on a particular price, which is the equilibrium price. This then fixes the quantity. The price can then change only as a result of a shift in either the supply or demand curves. It is easy to see that a surplus will exist at prices that are higher than the equilibrium price, since the quantity demanded will fall short of the quantity supplied. At prices lower than the equilibrium price, there will be a shortage of output, since quantity demanded will exceed quantity supplied. Once achieved, the equilibrium price and quantity persist until there is a change in demand and or supply. That is, either the demand curve shifts or the supply curve shifts. Let us look at our example of the market for corn to illustrate equilibrium. Now the market demand and market supply schedules have been combined in the table and the graph shown. The demand and supply curves intersect at the point E on the graph, which represents the equilibrium price of $3 a bushel and an equilibrium quantity of 6,000 bushels. At the $3 price, people are willing to buy 6,000 bushels of corn and producers are willing to supply 6,000 bushels of corn. There is thus the possibility of trade. Now at a price of $4, you can see that there will be a 2,500 bushel surplus, since 4,500 bushels will be demanded while 7,000 bushels will be supplied. At a price of $2 per bushel, on the other hand, there will be a 4,000 bushel shortage, because quantity demanded will be 8,000 while quantity supplied will only be 4,000 bushels. Now that was a simple graphical illustration of equilibrium. But as we've seen before, both supply and demand functions can be represented in equational form as well. So there should be some algebraic description of equilibrium as well. So let's see how this obtains in the context of a simple example. Let's say we write our market demand function as QD is equal to 100 minus 10p, and our market supply function as QS is equal to 40 plus 20p, where P is price and QD and QS are quantities demanded and quantities supplied respectively. Equilibrium price is then found by equating the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied, recalling that the equilibrium price exists when QD is equal to QS. In this case, the equilibrium price is $2. Let's see how this obtains. In the first step, we write QD is equal to QS. Then we substitute the expressions for QD and QS respectively. Finally, we just solve for P, and as you can see, P comes out to $2. Now, can any one of you tell me what the equilibrium quantity will be and how we can obtain this? Well, this is easy to do. All we have to do is plug P is equal to 2 into either QD or QS. So when you plug it into QS, you see that you get 40 plus 20 times 2 is equal to 80. When you plug it into QD, you get 100 minus 10 times 2, and you again get 80. Question: is this a coincidence that by plugging P is equal to 2 into QS and QD, we get the same answer? No, it is not a coincidence. It is because we have assumed in our calculation of P is equal to 2 that QD and QS are in fact equal. So for this example, we have solved for the equilibrium in algebraic terms by obtaining price is equal to 2 and quantity is equal to 80. So my friends, with that concluding note on equilibrium, we come to the end of our lecture today. Let's sum up on what we have learned today. We started with a discussion of supply, and we applied all the principles and concepts that we had learned in the context of our discussion on demand, and we applied them to supply. We began by looking at what the law of supply was, which was basically that as the price of a commodity increases, the quantity supplied will increase, which gave rise to an upward sloping supply curve. Once we had developed the individual supply curve, we saw how a market supply curve could be obtained by aggregating the individual supply curves horizontally. After doing that, we saw what were the factors which caused shifts in the supply curve, and we identified a few. One was input costs, another was expectations about future prices, another was external shocks beyond the control of producers, and we discussed other factors as well. Then we saw how each of these factors could shift the supply curve to the right or to the left, and it was very important to know which direction the supply curve would shift in. Finally, we talked a little bit about supply functions and how supply could be characterized in equational form. We gave the simple example of a supply function which was expressed in terms of price, which was QS is equal to C plus D P. Right? Remember that example? Yeah. After concluding our discussion on supply, we moved to a brief introduction to a discussion on equilibrium. So we were armed with our understanding of demand and supply, and we saw that equilibrium was simply a state in which demand was equal to supply. In other words, that there were no shortages and no surpluses. That essentially was what we discussed in today's lecture. So my friends, in our next lecture, we will talk about what happens when the market supply or market demand curves shift. What happens to equilibrium? What happens to the equilibrium price? What happens to the equilibrium quantity? Indeed, we will see that it is possible that a change in one factor causes both the market supply curve to shift and the market demand curve to shift. We will also briefly discuss the role of government in equilibrium analysis and how government intervention can create shortages and surpluses as well as cause the market equilibrium price and equilibrium quantities to change by shifting the supply or the demand curves. So until our next lecture, it is goodbye, Khuda Hafiz, take care of yourselves, and remember to visit the website to attempt those questions that have been put up for you. Wassalamu alaikum.